The word left his lips before his mind could catch it. A single syllable, spoken in the low, gravelly cadence of a man whose defenses had been dismantled by exhaustion and blood. The private medical suite instantly plunged into a vacuum so deep, so absolute, that the steady beep of the cardiac monitor sounded like an executioner's drum. Han Joon-Okoye froze, his sharp jaw locking into stone, his cold eyes wide with the horror of his own subconscious. Across the room, four armed operatives and the chief surgeon stopped breathing. Blessing's dark, expressive eyes met his through the haze of pain, and the silence that followed tore the world in half. Before we enter this world of shadow, obsession, and a confession that was never meant to be heard, please like, share, and subscribe. The rain outside the Mapo police precinct fell in thick, unrelenting sheets, drumming against the reinforced glass of Interrogation Room B. Inside, the air smelled of burnt instant coffee, damp wool, and institutional cruelty. Fluorescent bulbs buzzed overhead, casting a sickly white glare over the metal table where Blessing John sat with her wrists resting flat against the cold steel. She did not touch the paper cup of water they had pushed toward her 3 hours ago. Her spine was straight, her chin lifted at an angle that had once commanded respect in the high-ceilinged parlors of Victoria Island. Even in a simple ivory knit sweater spattered with road grime, her natural elegance remained entirely intact. Only the slight, rapid pulse fluttering at the hollow of her throat betrayed the terror coiled inside her ribs. Detective Kong leaned forward, slapping a manila folder onto the table. The photograph slid out, bullet-riddled shipping containers at Incheon Port, crates bearing the discreet seal of the Okoye Maritime Conglomerate, and surveillance stills of Blessing leaving a courier office in 81 hours before the docks erupted in gunfire. "Your father's old associates didn't disappear when he died in Lagos, Miss John," Kong said, his voice flat with bureaucratic malice. "They simply migrated. And now you're facilitating transactions between West African shell companies and the Silent Sovereign." Blessing's soft, expressive eyes did not waver. "I run a registered artisan bakery in Yongsan. I bake bread, Detective. If a courier service uses my address as a drop point, that is a matter of commercial postal fraud, not international smuggling. You expect us to believe that the daughter of Emeka John is just a baker?" Kong sneered, tapping the photograph of the dead men at the docks. "You are an illegal asset, and by sunrise, you will be in a federal detention cell awaiting extradition." Blessing remained silent. She had learned long ago, in the brutal aftermath of her family's collapse, that words given to desperate men were merely weapons they had not yet figured out how to use against you. The door behind Kong did not knock. It did not swing open with a dramatic crash. It simply unlatched, the heavy deadbolt sliding back with a muted, metallic click that seemed to suck every cubic inch of warmth out of the room. Two senior commissioners, men whose faces regularly appeared on national news broadcasts, stepped backward into the hallway with their heads bowed so low their chins pressed into their ties. Behind them, the corridor was entirely silent. No footsteps, no whispers, only the heavy, suffocating pressure of a predator entering an enclosed space. Han Joon-Okoye stepped over the threshold. He was 38 years old, broad-shouldered and towering, dressed in a bespoke charcoal overcoat that had not caught a single drop of rain. His presence did not merely fill the interrogation room, it erased it. His sharp, sculpted jawline was set in immutable stillness, his dark, piercing eyes sweeping the small enclosure with the detached precision of a monarch inspecting a slaughterhouse. Visible above the starched white collar of his dress shirt, wrapping around the left side of his throat, was the dark, intricate ink of his heritage, a traditional Korean tiger entwined seamlessly with ancient Igbo uli spirals, rising toward his jaw like an indelible mark of sovereign blood. Detective Kong stood up, so violently his chair screeched against the linoleum. "Mr. Han, this is an active federal inquiry. You cannot." Joon-Okoye did not look at him. He did not acknowledge the detective's existence by so much as a fraction of a degree. He walked with measured, unhurried steps until he stood directly beside Blessing's chair. The scent of sandalwood, cold rain, and dark cedar rolled over her, suffocating and impossibly familiar. Blessing felt the fine hairs on her arms stand up. She did not look up at him, but her breath caught in her chest. Joon-Okoye raised his right hand. Across the knuckles, the symbolic woolly geometric lines flexed against his bronze skin as his fingers came to rest flat on the metal table, directly over the police photographs. "The inquiry is concluded," Joon-Okoye said. His voice was a low, resonant baritone that did not rise above a murmur, yet it vibrated through the metal table, through the concrete floor, through the marrow of Blessing's bones. It was the voice of a man who never negotiated because the world had already agreed to his terms. Kang's face drained of color. "Sir, the Port Authority." "The Port Authority has already issued a formal retraction," Joon-Okoye said calmly, his eyes remaining fixed on the empty wall opposite him. "The contraband belonged to a rogue logistics subcontractor who has already ceased to exist. Miss John has no affiliation with the port. She has no affiliation with your precinct." He paused, the silence stretching until Kang began to sweat visibly under the buzzing lights. "She belongs to my household," Joon-Okoye said, the syllables dropping like lead weights into the room. "And you have kept her waiting in a drafty room for 3 hours." Blessing's fingers curled into the fabric of her slacks. His household. The phrase was a legal fiction, a contractual shield he had used to place her under his suffocating surveillance 6 months ago, when her father's unresolved debts threatened to drag both their names into the light. She was not his guest. She was not his lover. She was his captive collateral, an inconvenient obligation he kept locked away in the gilded fortress of his Hanamdong estate. Joon-Okoye turned his piercing gaze down toward her. The coldness in his eyes was absolute, a wall of permafrost built over 7 years of calculated isolation. "Stand up," he commanded softly. Blessing lifted her chin, her soft eyes meeting his with a quiet, stubborn defiance that never failed to make the muscle in his jaw twitch. She did not hurry. She rose to her feet with the deliberate grace of a woman who refused to be treated like an object, even by the most dangerous man in the peninsula. Joon-Okoye removed his overcoat with a single, fluid motion and draped it over her shoulders. The heavy wool was warm from his body, carrying the heavy, intoxicating weight of his presence. His fingers brushed the side of her neck as he adjusted the collar, a contact so brief, so electric, that Blessing felt her knees threaten to buckle. He did not look at the detectives again. He turned toward the open door. "If you ever place your hands on her again, Detective Kang," Joon-Okoye said without turning around, "I will buy this precinct and demolish it while you are still inside." The armored Maybach glided through the rain-drenched midnight streets of Gangnam with the smooth, eerie silence of a submarine. Outside, neon signs in Korean script blurred into streaks of magenta and electric blue against the wet glass. Inside the passenger cabin, the silence was a living, breathing entity. Blessing sat pressed against the far door, the heavy wool coat still wrapped tightly around her frame. Her hands were buried in her lap, her knuckles white. Across the leather divide, Han Joon-Okoye sat completely motionless, his hands resting on his thighs, his dark eyes staring straight ahead into the partition that separated them from the driver. The cuff of his right sleeve had ridden up slightly, exposing the dark ink along his inner wrist, a coiled serpent eating its own tail, etched with West African geometric patterns that symbolized eternity and unbreakable control. "You should not have gone to the courier office," he said. His voice was entirely devoid of inflection, yet the rebuke sliced through the air like a scalpel. Blessing did not look at him. "A package arrived from Lagos addressed to my mother's maiden name. I had to know if it was family." "You have no family," Joon-Okoye said coldly. "Your father saw to that before he died. Your only reality is the protection I afford you and the boundaries I set for you." Blessing turned her head sharply, her dark eyes flashing with suppressed fire. "I am not an animal you keep in a pen, Mr. Han. I agreed to your financial oversight to clear my father's ledger, not to surrender my autonomy. I have a business. I have a life." "You have a target on your back," he countered, his head turning slowly to meet her gaze. The interior lights of the car illuminated the harsh, beautiful symmetry of his face, the high cheekbones of his Korean mother, the rich, deep complexion of his Nigerian father, and the terrifying, unreadable void in his eyes. And every time you step outside the perimeter I have established, you invite chaos into my jurisdiction. Then let me go, she whispered, leaning forward, the raw emotion in her voice contrasting sharply with his granite composure. Cancel the debt. Let me take what little I have left and leave Seoul. You look at me every day as if my very existence is an insult to your peace. Why keep me? Joon-Okoye did not blink. His gaze dropped to her mouth for a fraction of a second, so fast she might have imagined it, before returning to her eyes. Because I do not leave loose ends, he said softly. And because you are the only variable I have not yet resolved. The car turned sharply into the subterranean gates of his private Hanam-dong estate, the massive steel barrier sliding shut behind them with the finality of a prison vault. The Hanam-dong residence was a monument to absolute control. Built into the side of the mountain overlooking the Han River, the structure was a masterpiece of black granite, floor-to-ceiling reinforced glass, and minimalist wood. There were no family portraits, no warm textiles, no scattered books. It was a space designed by a man who lived as though any sign of domesticity was a fatal vulnerability. Later that evening, the storm intensified, rattling the massive panoramic windows of the second-floor library. Blessing stood near the glass, holding a cup of unsweetened rooibos tea she had brewed in the industrial kitchen downstairs. Below, the city of Seoul lay stretched out like a field of dying embers beneath the rain. She heard him enter before he made a sound. It was not a noise, but a shift in the air pressure, the unmistakable gravity that always accompanied his presence. She did not turn around. Is your surveillance team satisfied that I didn't hide microfilms in my flower bins? Joon-Okoye walked toward the window, stopping 3 paces away. He had discarded his suit jacket and tie. His black dress shirt was unbuttoned at the top, revealing the sharp ridge of his collarbone where the tiger's tail curled into an intricate Igbo chevron pattern. In his hand, he held a thin crystal glass containing 2 fingers of dark whiskey. He did not drink. He merely held it, the ice remaining perfectly still. Your bakery is clean, he said quietly. The courier package contained personal letters from your aunt in Ibadan. Nothing that compromises security. Did you read them? She asked, turning her head to look at him. Every word. Blessing felt a surge of heat rise to her cheeks. Those were private family matters. Memories of my mother. You forfeited privacy the night your father's creditors traced his forged bonds to my holding firm, he replied, his profile stark against the lightning outside. Until that ledger is balanced, everything you touch belongs to my assessment. You speak of ledgers and assessments because you are terrified of anything human, Blessing said, her voice dropping into a dangerous, intimate register. She stepped closer, closing the distance between them until she could see the subtle pulse beating beneath the tattoo on his neck. You built this fortress, you surround yourself with armed guards, and you wear that stone mask because 7 years ago, a woman proved you could bleed. The atmosphere in the library shifted instantly from cold detachment to lethal tension. Joon-Okoye did not move, but the air around him seemed to drop 10 degrees. His dark eyes shifted toward her, piercing and predatory. For the first time, she saw a hairline crack in his porcelain control, a dark, turbulent fury swirling in the depths of his gaze. 7 years ago, his marriage to the daughter of a prominent Seoul banking family had ended in an explosion of industrial espionage, public humiliation, and bloodshed that had nearly dismantled the Han Joon-Okoye empire. On the night the betrayal was finalized, Joon-Okoye had buried the woman's memory, eliminated every associate who had facilitated the treason, and carved an oath into his own soul. Never again. He had not touched a woman since. He had not allowed anyone past the perimeter of his calculated silence. You speak with remarkable confidence for someone who exists entirely at my mercy, Miss John, he said, his voice dropping so low it was almost lost beneath the rumble of thunder. I am not afraid of you, June, she whispered, using his given name intentionally, testing the forbidden boundary between them. The glass in his hand tightened. The tattoo across his knuckles flexed. Then you are a fool, he murmured, taking a single step toward her. He was so close now that she could feel the heat radiating from his chest through his linen shirt. Fear is the only thing that keeps people alive in my presence. No, Blessing said, her soft eyes searching his unreadable face with a quiet, devastating perception. Fear is what you use to keep people from seeing that you are completely alone. Joon-Okoye stared down at her. His chest rose and fell in a slow, controlled rhythm. For 3 agonizing seconds, the space between their lips seemed to shrink, charged with a magnetic, forbidden pull that defied all his rules, all his vows, all his ironclad discipline. His left hand lifted slightly, his fingers hovering inches from her jawline, as if his body were acting independently of his frozen mind. Then, the moment shattered. His phone buzzed on the mahogany desk across the room, a sharp, harsh vibration that broke the trance. Joon-Okoye lowered his hand instantly, his face hardening back into an impenetrable mask of granite. He stepped back, the invisible wall slamming down between them with brutal efficiency. "Go to your quarters," he said, his voice once again cold, formal, and entirely detached. "Tomorrow evening, you will accompany me to the Shilla Hotel. Chairman Choi is hosting a maritime summit. You will remain at my side, you will speak to no one, and you will play the role of my private secretary." Blessing looked at him, her heart aching with a strange, hollow frustration she refused to acknowledge. "Why take me into the lion's den?" "Because Choi was your father's primary creditor," Joon-Okoye said, walking toward the desk without looking back. "And I want him to see that whatever you own now belongs to me." The grand ballroom of the Shilla Hotel glittered with the obscene wealth of East Asia's industrial elite. Crystal chandeliers the size of small automobiles hung from vaulted ceilings, casting fractured light over hundreds of executives in custom tuxedos and women draped in millions of dollars of diamonds. Blessing stood near a marble pillar, holding a flute of sparkling water. She wore a floor-length gown of midnight blue silk, tailored to perfection, its simple lines accentuating the natural, regal curve of her neck and shoulders. Her dark hair was swept up into an elegant, sculptural chignon, held in place by 2 minimalist gold pins. She looked like royalty who had wandered into a den of merchants. Several meters away, Han Joon-Okoye stood at the center of a circle of corporate titans and foreign dignitaries. He wore a bespoke double-breasted tuxedo that accentuated the broad span of his shoulders and the lean, powerful frame beneath. His watch was a vintage Patek Philippe, but his real statement was the visible ink at his collar, the tiger and the uli patterns peeking above his satin lapel, a deliberate, arrogant reminder to every man in the room that he operated above their laws. He spoke rarely, offering only curt nods or single-word assessments, yet every man in the circle leaned forward to catch his voice. He commanded the room through absolute restraint. Blessing watched him, noting the way his eyes never truly settled on the people speaking to him. Every 3 seconds, his gaze drifted across the room, tracking the exits, the security placements, and her. He was watching her like a hawk guarding its only possession. "Miss John, isn't it?" The voice was oily, smoothed over by decades of expensive scotch and unearned privilege. Blessing turned her head to see Director Choi Kong-min, the 34-year-old heir to the Choi Maritime Group, standing uncomfortably close. His eyes ran down the length of her silk gown with an appraisal that made her skin crawl. "Director Choi," Blessing said politely, taking half a step back. "Good evening. I was surprised to see you on the arm of the sovereign tonight," Choi said, swirling the champagne in his glass. "When your father died in that unfortunate Lagos incident, we all assumed his assets were liquidated. We didn't realize he left behind something so exquisite." Blessing's expression chilled, her jaw tightening. "My father left behind complex business dealings, Director Choi, none of which concern you this evening." Choi took another step forward, his smile turning predatory as he reached out a hand, his fingers aiming for the bare skin of her shoulder. "Your father owed my family $7 million, Miss John. Han Joon-Okoye may have bought the commercial paper, but debt has a way of transferring to more personal terms." Before Choi's fingers could graze Blessing's skin, a hand clamped down on his wrist. The grip was not loud, but the sound of Choi's champagne flute slipping from his fingers and shattering against the carpet echoed like a gunshot in the immediate vicinity. Han Joon-Okoye stood between them. He had crossed the 20 feet of ballroom floor without making a sound. His tall frame completely eclipsed Choi, casting a long, dark shadow over the younger executive. Joon-Okoye's left hand held Choi's wrist in an iron vise, his fingers pressing precisely into the nerve cluster. The dual heritage tattoo on his inner wrist was fully exposed beneath his French cuff, dark and menacing against his bronze skin. "Mr. Han," Choi gasped, his face turning an alarming shade of purple as his knees buckled under the immense, downward pressure. "I was merely welcoming your associate." Joon-Okoye did not raise his voice. He leaned in slightly, his sharp jawline inches from Choi's ear, his dark eyes burning with an icy, terrifying stillness that made the surrounding guests step backward in sheer instinct. "You are breathing the air she expels," Joon-Okoye said in a quiet, conversational murmur that only Choi and Blessing could hear. "If your fingers come within an inch of her skin again, I will remove your arm at the elbow and present it to your father as a dividend." I apologize," Choi wheezed, his fingers going entirely white from lack of blood. "Please." Joon-Okoye released him with a flick of his wrist, as if discarding a piece of soiled linen. Choi stumbled backward, clutching his bruised arm, and vanished into the crowd without looking back. The surrounding murmurs died instantly under Joon-Okoye's sweeping, murderous glare. He turned to Blessing, his chest expanding with a slow, deep breath. "Did he touch you?" he demanded softly. Blessing looked at him, her heart thumping wildly against her ribs, not from Choi's threat, but from the raw, possessive fury she had just witnessed in the eyes of a man who claimed she was merely an asset. "No," she said, her voice steady. "He didn't touch me." Joon-Okoye's jaw remained locked. His hand reached out and took her elbow, firmly, undeniably, his long fingers wrapping around her arm with an authority that left no room for debate. "We are leaving," he said. The storm had turned the Olympic Expressway into a slick, treacherous river of black asphalt. The Maybach sped through the darkness, flanked by 2 security SUVs. Inside the cabin, the tension had reached a fever pitch. Joon-Okoye sat with his jaw clenched, his tie pulled loose, his gaze fixed on the side mirror. Blessing rubbed her bare arms, the adrenaline from the ballroom still humming in her veins. "You made a scene back there. Choi's father is allied with the Incheon syndicate. You provoked them." "Choi is a dog who barks because he thinks his lineage protects him," Joon-Okoye said coldly. He needed to be reminded of his place. "And what is my place, June?" she asked, her voice cracking slightly with the weight of the unspoken tension that had been suffocating them for months. "You protect me from men like Choi, but you look at me as if I am your executioner. What am I to you?" Joon-Okoye turned his head slowly. The shadows inside the speeding car cut across the sharp angles of his face, making him look ancient, dangerous, and impossibly tired. "You are a complication," he said, each word deliberate and harsh. "You are an intrusion into a life I spent 7 years perfecting. You make me look at things I buried. You make me feel." He stopped abruptly, his teeth clicking together as he caught himself on the precipice of a confession. "Feel what?" she whispered, leaning across the leather console, her soft eyes demanding the truth he had spent years running from. "Tell me." Before he could answer, the world exploded into violence. A massive, heavy-duty dump truck, running without headlights, blew through the intersection from an off-ramp and slammed directly into the lead security SUV, obliterating it in a shower of sparks, metal, and flame. "Ambush," the driver screamed, slamming on the brakes. The Maybach fishtailed across the wet expressway, its tires screaming against the asphalt. Joon-Okoye moved before the car had even stabilized. His long arm shot across the console, grabbing Blessing by the waist and pulling her violently against his chest, shielding her head and torso with his own body as the second attack came. A black armored SUV rammed the side of the Maybach, the impact shattering the reinforced passenger window into a web of opaque cracks. "Keep your head down," Joon-Okoye snarled into her hair. The car spun out, crashing through the highway barrier and coming to a violent, jarring halt against the concrete support pillar of an overpass. Gunfire immediately erupted outside, the heavy, rhythmic thud of automatic rifles tearing through the Maybach's armored panels. The driver was hit through the windshield, slumping over the steering wheel. Joon-Okoye did not panic. His mind, forged in the brutal underworld wars of his youth, shifted instantly into tactical lethality. He reached beneath the console, pulling free a modified semi-automatic pistol. His shirt was torn at the shoulder, exposing the broad, muscled span of his chest and the dark, intricate ink of the tiger's face roaring over his heart. "Blessing, look at me," he commanded, his hands cupping her face with a sudden, desperate roughness. Blessing looked up, her eyes wide with shock, blood trickling from a small cut on her forehead where she had struck the dash. "Stay behind me," he said, his dark eyes burning into hers with a fierce, terrifying clarity. "If I move left, you move left. Do not look at the bodies. Do not stop running until we reach the secondary extraction point. Do you hear me? June. Do you hear me?" he roared over the sound of incoming bullets. "Yes." He kicked the damaged door open, using it as a shield, and fired 3 precise shots into the darkness. 2 men in tactical gear collapsed instantly into the rain. Joon-Okoye grabbed Blessing's hand, his tattooed knuckles locking around her fingers with unbreakable strength, and pulled her out into the freezing downpour. The battle beneath the overpass was brief, savage, and bloody. Joon-Okoye fought with the terrifying efficiency of an apex predator. He moved through the shadows with silent, lethal precision, eliminating the remaining ambushers one by one while keeping his body positioned perpetually between the gunfire and Blessing. When the last attacker fell to the wet pavement, the highway was silent except for the hiss of rain on burning metal and the distant wail of sirens. Joon-Okoye stood in the center of the road, his chest heaving, his weapon lowered. Rain washed the blood from his hands, mingling with the dark ink on his wrists. He turned to Blessing, who stood shivering against the concrete pillar, clutching her bruised ribs. "Blessing," he breathed, taking a step toward her. Then, his eyes caught the dark, widening stain blooming across the front of her ivory dress. A stray round from the final spray of gunfire had ricocheted beneath the overpass, catching her high on the right side of her abdomen. In the shock and adrenaline of the escape, she hadn't made a sound. Blessing looked down at her dress, her fingers touching the crimson fabric in detached confusion. "June." Her knees gave out. Joon-Okoye crossed the distance between them in a soundless blur, catching her before her body could hit the asphalt. "No, no, no," he chanted, the cold, aristocratic veneer completely shattering into dust. He dropped to his knees in the mud and blood, gathering her into his arms, pressing his hand frantically against the wound to stem the flow. The tattoo on his neck pulsed violently as a sound of pure, unadulterated agony tore from his throat, a raw, animal roar that echoed through the concrete underpass. "Stay with me," he commanded, his voice breaking, tears mixing with the rain streaming down his sharp face. "Blessing, look at my eyes. Look at me." Her eyelids fluttered, her soft eyes trying desperately to focus on the terrifying, beautiful face above her. "It's cold, June. I have you," he wept, lifting her entirely into his arms, holding her against his chest as if he could force his own life into her failing body. "I have you. I am not letting you go. Do you hear me? You are not permitted to leave me." He ran through the darkness, carrying her toward the headlights of the arriving reinforcement vehicles, his mind consumed by a terrifying, all-consuming realization that obliterated 7 years of vows, rules, and armor. If she died tonight, his world would end. The private trauma wing of the Seoul National University Hospital was cleared within 4 minutes of Han Joon-Okoye's arrival. Armed operatives from the Okoye syndicate sealed every entrance, pushing hospital administrators and regular staff out of the corridor. The air was sterile, cold, and thick with the sharp tang of antiseptic and blood. The double doors of the operating room swung open with a violent crash. Joon-Okoye burst into the surgical bay, carrying Blessing in his arms. His bespoke suit was ruined, soaked with rain, coated in grime, and saturated with her blood. His hair was wild, his eyes bloodshot and incandescent with a madness that made the waiting surgical team freeze in terror. He laid her gently onto the sterile gurney. Her face was gray, her breathing shallow and ragged. "Get the bypass ready," Chief Surgeon Dr. Min shouted, snapping on his latex gloves while nurses scrambled for lines and monitors. "She's in hypovolemic shock. Blood pressure is 40/20. The room became a blur of frantic activity. Scissors cutting away silk. Monitors screeching. The sharp scent of iodine. Joon-Okoye did not leave her side. He stood over the gurney, his large, tattooed hand gripping Blessing's limp fingers with a pressure that bordered on desperate violence. The tiger across his bare chest was smeared with her blood, the ink looking dark and wet beneath the harsh surgical lights. "Sir, you must leave the sterile field," Dr. Min yelled over the din of the alarms, reaching for a scalpel. "You cannot be in here." "Save her," Joon-Okoye said. His voice was not loud, but it possessed a terrifying, vibrating resonance that cut through the mechanical chaos of the room. "Mr. Han, we need to perform an emergency laparotomy. There are protocols. We need next of kin authorization for the high-risk surgical indemnity or the hospital board." "I don't care about your board," Joon-Okoye roared, slamming his bloody hand against the instrument tray, sending surgical steel clattering across the tile floor. Dr. Min flinched, stepping back. "Sir, legal protocol dictates that only a direct family member or a legal spouse can authorize this procedure under active hemorrhage conditions without prior clearance. Who is this woman to you?" The question hung in the air, sharp and demanding, colliding with the frantic beeping of the failing heart monitor. Joon-Okoye looked down at Blessing's pale, still face. He looked at the soft eyes closed in unconsciousness, the woman who had defied him, who had seen through his armor, who had survived his cruelty and invaded his soul until every breath he took without her felt like suffocation. The 7 years of ice shattered. The vow dissolved into ash. The iron control that had ruled his life snapped under the weight of sheer, unadulterated terror. His mind short-circuited. His conscious defenses collapsed. "She is my wife," Joon-Okoye shouted. The word ripped from his chest like an explosion. "She is my wife," he screamed again, his voice cracking with a raw, devastating agony that echoed off the sterile tiles. "Now save her life, or I will burn this hospital to the ground with everyone inside it." The operating room instantly went dead silent. The surgeons froze. The nurses stopped mid-motion. The armed operatives standing guard at the threshold looked up in absolute, paralyzed shock. The word hung in the air, heavy, radioactive, and utterly irreversible. "Wife." On the gurney, through the haze of anesthesia and fading consciousness, Blessing's eyelids trembled. Her dark, expressive eyes cracked open just a sliver, locking onto the wild, tormented face of Han Joon-Okoye, the man who had sworn never to love again, staring down at her with the terrifying realization of what he had just spoken into the world. And in that suffocating, breathless silence, the universe shifted on its axis. The silence stretched for 3 agonizing seconds, vibrating with the weight of a catastrophic revelation. Joon-Okoye stood frozen over the gurney, his chest heaving, his bloody hand still gripping Blessing's limp fingers. His sharp jaw was slack with horror, not at the surgeons, not at the danger, but at the treason of his own tongue. He had not spoken that word in 7 years. He had buried it beneath millions of dollars, layers of black wool, and the corpses of his enemies. He had treated the concept of marriage as a terminal weakness, an open vein that invited death. And now, he had declared it aloud in a room full of witnesses, claiming the daughter of his enemy as the keeper of his soul. Dr. Min was the first to recover, his professional instincts kicking in over his sheer terror of the sovereign. "Begin the anesthesia. Push 2 units of O-negative immediately. Clamp the bleeders." The room erupted back into motion. Hands pushed Joon-Okoye back. Nurses swarmed the gurney, cutting off his line of sight. "Mr. Han, you must step out now," Dr. Min said, his voice firm with the authority of a surgeon entering a life-or-death battle. "We have the authorization. Let us work." Joon-Okoye did not resist as two of his own operatives, their faces pale with shock, gently guided him backward through the swinging doors into the private corridor. The heavy doors clicked shut, sealing blessing inside the sterile chamber of life and death. Joon-Okoye stood alone in the center of the empty, brightly lit hallway. His reflection stared back at him from the polished floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the rain-slicked city. He looked like a madman. His midnight blue tuxedo was shredded, his white shirt stained crimson with Blessing's blood. The dual heritage tattoo on his neck and chest was stark and violent against his bronze skin. His right hand was trembling. He raised it slowly, staring at his blood-soaked fingers, the fingers that had held hers, the fingers that had felt her pulse fading into nothingness. "She is my wife." The words echoed inside the hollow chambers of his skull, mocking him, stripping away the last remnants of the lie he had lived for nearly a decade. He had not said it to bypass hospital bureaucracy. He had not said it as a tactical maneuver. He had said it because, in the terrifying moment when her life was slipping through his fingers, his soul had discarded the fiction of his control and spoken the only truth that mattered. He was obsessed with her. He was possessed by her. And if she died on that operating table, Han Joon-Okoye would never leave this hospital alive. The red glow of the surgical bay lamp burned into the polished granite floor like a puddle of neon blood. 4 hours had passed since the steel doors sealed Han Joon-Okoye out of the operating theater. He had not sat down. He had not taken a glass of water. He had not allowed anyone to clean the drying crimson spattered across his knuckles, his neck, or the torn silk of his shirt. He stood in the center of the private corridor like an obsidian obelisk, his sharp jaw locked in a stillness so rigid it seemed carved from volcanic glass. His operatives lined the perimeter at 5-meter intervals, their assault rifles held low, their earpieces silent. None of them dared to breathe loudly. They had seen the sovereign execute rivals with a flick of his wrist. They had seen him bankrupt conglomerates over a single disrespectful syllable. But none of them had ever seen the mask crack. None of them had ever heard him scream. The tattoo on the right side of his neck, the coiled uli spiral rising into the jaws of a Korean tiger, pulsed with the slow, terrifying rhythm of his carotid artery. The double doors hissed open. Dr. Min stepped out, pulling down his surgical mask with trembling, sweat-slicked fingers. His scrub top was soaked through. Behind him, the low mechanical rhythm of a functioning ventilator drifted into the hall. Joon-Okoye did not move toward him. He merely shifted his piercing dark eyes. The weight of that single gaze nearly forced the chief surgeon to his knees. "The bullet missed the hepatic artery by 3 millimeters, Dr. Min whispered, bowing until his spine was horizontal. "The hemorrhage is controlled. We repaired the abdominal wall and stabilized her thoracic cavity. She is alive, Mr. Han. She survived the night." The silence in the hallway did not break. It deepened, expanding into a breathless void. Joon-Okoye closed his eyes for a fraction of a second. It was the only tell. A single, imperceptible dip of his chin before the stone facade snapped back into place, colder and more impenetrable than before. "Move her to the penthouse suite," Joon-Okoye said. His voice was once again the smooth, dead baritone of a man who owned the air everyone else was breathing. "Post 12 men on the floor. If a single person without triple alpha clearance comes within 20 paces of her door, execute them where they stand." "Understood, sir," Dr. Min stammered. Joon-Okoye walked past him without another glance, the scent of antiseptic, rain, and iron trailing in his wake. The penthouse suite on the 12th floor of the hospital was not a medical room. It was a private fortress designed for heads of state. The windows were ballistic-grade laminate, tinted against the dawn light breaking gray and cold over the Han River. Blessing lay in the center of the massive motorized bed, draped in pristine white Egyptian cotton. And 4-line dripped saline and pain medication into the back of her left hand. Her skin, usually glowing with the rich, warm undertones of her heritage, was pale, but the steady rise and fall of her chest proved that the darkness had not claimed her. Joon-Okoye sat in a leather armchair 3 feet from the bedside. He had changed into a fresh black shirt, the top buttons undone, the dark ink over his collarbone and chest partially visible in the dim morning light. He had washed the blood from his hands, but the skin around his knuckles remained raw, stained by the memory of her life leaking through his fingers. He watched her face. Every subtle shift in her expression, every slight flutter of her eyelashes under the sedation, was catalogued by a mind that had spent 38 years analyzing threat vectors. But this was not tactical analysis. This was an ache so deep, so foreign to his engineered reality, that it felt like an internal hemorrhage. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. The ooly markings across his wrists caught the gray light. "She is my wife." The memory of his own voice snarling the forbidden word made his stomach turn with self-loathing. It had been an aberration. A tactical misfire caused by shock and sleep deprivation. He was the silent sovereign. He did not have attachments. He had subordinates, assets, and enemies. To call a woman by that title was to hand her the blade and guide her hand to his throat. He had done it once in his youth, and it had nearly cost him his empire and his sanity. He would not do it again. On the bed, Blessing let out a soft, fractured breath. Her dark, expressive eyes fluttered open, squinting against the soft ambient light of the room. She blinked slowly, disoriented, the sharp ache in her abdomen tethering her instantly to reality. She turned her head on the pillow. Her gaze found him immediately. Joon-Okoye did not move. He did not smile. His sharp jawline remained set in granite, his dark eyes meeting hers with an intensity that sucked the oxygen out of the space between them. "You are in the private wing of Seoul National University Hospital," he said, his voice flat, controlled, and utterly devoid of the madness that had consumed him 4 hours earlier. "The attackers have been neutralized. The wound was clean. You will make a full recovery in 6 weeks." Blessing looked at him, her soft eyes taking in every detail, the dark circles beneath his piercing eyes, the fresh shirt that could not hide the tension coiled in his shoulders, the deliberate, defensive distance he maintained. She remembered everything. She remembered the screech of tires, the explosion of glass, the freezing downpour under the overpass. She remembered his arms lifting her from the asphalt, his tears on her skin, and the terrifying, animal roar that tore from his throat in the surgical bay. "I heard you," she whispered. Her voice was raw, barely more than a breath, but it landed in the quiet room with the force of a detonator. Joon-Okoye did not flinch. "You were delirious from blood loss. You heard the panic of an emergency room." "I was conscious, June," she said softly, her eyes holding his with that quiet, unyielding Nigerian strength that had always infuriated him. "I heard Dr. Min ask for authorization. And I heard what you called me." The muscle in his jaw jumped. The tattoo on his collarbone shifted as his chest rose with a slow, measured inhalation. "It was an administrative formality," he said coldly, each word clipped like a legal clause. "Under Korean medical protocol, high-risk surgical indemnity requires immediate spousal or direct familial consent during unverified TRIA. Had I not claimed legal authority over your person, the surgical board would have delayed the laparotomy by 20 minutes to clear liability. You would have bled to death on the table." Blessing stared at him. A faint, sad smile touched the corner of her pale lips. "You are a very convincing liar, Mr. Han," she murmured. "To your directors. To your syndicate. To the entire city of Seoul." She paused, her breath catching as the pain in her side flared. "But you didn't say it to the hospital board, June," she whispered, her eyes boring into the stone of his face. "You screamed it at the ceiling. You screamed it as if you were terrified that if you didn't claim me, God would take me back." The room plunged into an agonizing stillness. Joon-Okoye stood up. He did not rise gracefully. He moved with the sudden, coiled violence of a predator whose cage had been rattled. He stepped to the edge of the bed, towering over her, his shadow swallowing her small frame entirely. He leaned down until his face was inches from hers, the dark scent of cedar, cold steel, and sandalwood enveloping her senses. "Do not mistake survival instincts for sentimentality, Miss John," he hissed, his baritone dropping to a lethal, intimate register. "I keep what is mine because I do not allow my enemies the satisfaction of taking it. You are collateral for your father's debt. Nothing more. Nothing less. Blessing did not look away. She lifted her hand slowly, fighting the heavy pull of the foreline, and rested her fingertips against the back of his right hand where the ooly spirals were inked into his bronze skin. His entire body went rigid. His breath stopped. "Your hands were shaking when you touched my face in the rain," she whispered. "A creditor does not weep over collateral." Joon-Okoye pulled his hand back as if her touch had burned through his skin. His eyes were a storm of dark, dangerous fury, a man waging total war against his own treasonous heart. He straightened his spine, adjusting the cuffs of his shirt with mechanical precision, the iron walls slamming down so violently she could almost hear the locks engaging. "You will remain here under guard until you are cleared for transport," he said, turning toward the door. "Do not speak of this again." He walked out, the heavy oak door clicking shut behind him with the finality of a guillotine. Later that evening, the rain over Seoul turned into a biting, early winter sleet that coated the high-rise towers of Gangnam in a sheath of black ice. On the 62nd floor of the Okoye Maritime Headquarters, the executive boardroom was bathed in the dim, amber light of a single chandelier. The obsidian conference table was empty except for 3 crystal tumblers and a heavy file folder stamped with the seal of the Incheon Maritime Commission. At the far end of the table sat Chairman Choi Byung-ho, a 60-year-old syndicate patriarch whose family had controlled the western ports since the end of the war. Beside him stood his son, Director Choi Kong-min, his left wrist wrapped in a heavy orthopedic brace where Joon-Okoye had crushed the bone 24 hours earlier. Han Joon-Okoye sat at the head of the table. He was dressed in a 3-piece charcoal suit, his posture impeccably erect, his hands resting flat against the polished obsidian. The tattoo on his right wrist was visible beneath his French cuff, the geometric lines sharp and dark against his skin. He had not spoken for 6 minutes. The silence in the room was suffocating, thick with the implied threat of total annihilation. Chairman Choi cleared his throat, the sound dry and nervous in the cavernous space. "Mr. Han, we are here to discuss the unfortunate misunderstanding on the Olympic Expressway last night." Joon-Okoye did not blink. An ambush utilizing military-grade armor and unregistered automatic weapons is not a misunderstanding, Chairman Choi. It is an act of war. "My son acted rashly," the elder Choi conceded, casting a venomous glance at Kong-min. "He believed your acquisition of the John family assets in Lagos compromised our joint revenue streams. He has been disciplined. We are prepared to offer 3 container terminals in Busan as restitution." Joon-Okoye leaned back slightly. The leather of his chair did not creak. "Your son did not target my revenue streams," Joon-Okoye said softly. "He targeted a vehicle carrying a member of my household. And in doing so, he forfeited your family's right to operate in this hemisphere." Kong-min slammed his uninjured hand against the table, his face flushed with humiliating rage. "She is an African criminal's daughter," Kong-min snarled, stepping forward, ignoring his father's frantic gesture to stand down. "You have compromised our entire syndicate's political standing for an outsider. The whole city is talking, Joon-Okoye. We have informants inside the medical board." Kong-min leaned over the table, his eyes wild with desperate malice. "We heard the sovereign lost his mind at SNU Hospital," Kong-min sneered, the words echoing with toxic amusement. "We heard you were on your knees in the trauma bay, covered in filth, screaming at the surgeons that the Nigerian girl was your wife." The word hit the room like a chemical weapon. Director Park, standing in the shadows behind Joon-Okoye, reached inside his jacket, his hand resting on the grip of his sidearm. Joon-Okoye did not reach for a weapon. He did not raise his voice. He did not change his expression. He simply stood up. The motion was so smooth, so devoid of human agitation, that it carried the terrifying finality of a tidal wave rising on the horizon. He walked around the obsidian table with slow, measured steps, the ooly markings on his knuckles flexing with each stride. Chairman Choi went white. "Mr. Han, Kong-min was out of line." Joon-Okoye reached Kong-min in 3 paces. His left hand shot out like a steel piston, gripping Kong-min by the throat and lifting the younger man completely off the floor, slamming him against the reinforced glass window overlooking the frozen city. The glass groaned under the impact. Kang Min choked, his legs kicking frantically in the empty air, his hands clawing at Joon-Okoye's tattooed fingers. Joon-Okoye leaned in close, his piercing dark eyes locking onto Kang Min's bulging, bloodshot gaze. The tiger on his neck seemed to bare its fangs as his collar pulled taut. "If you ever speak that word in my presence again," Joon-Okoye whispered, his voice a low, terrifying vibration that rattled the windowpane, "I will dismantle your father's empire piece by piece, throw his body into Incheon Harbor, and bury you alive beneath the tarmac of the terminal you tried to offer me." He tightened his grip for 3 agonizing seconds, watching the light fade from Kang Min's eyes, before releasing him. Kang Min collapsed to the floor in a heap, coughing violently, gasping for air. Joon-Okoye turned to the elder Choi, who sat frozen in his chair, trembling with sheer terror. "You have 24 hours to transfer all Incheon logistics rights to my holding firm," Joon-Okoye said, brushing an invisible speck of dust from his sleeve. "If your family is still on the peninsula by midnight tomorrow, my operatives will consider you target practice." He did not wait for an answer. He walked out of the boardroom, the doors sliding shut behind him, leaving the Choi dynasty broken in the dark. 3 days later, the transfer was executed in the dead of night. Blessing was moved from the hospital to Joon-Okoye's mountain estate in Songbuk-dong, a traditional Korean estate fortified with modern military-grade security, hidden deep within a forest of ancient pine trees behind 3 rings of electronic gates. The main pavilion was built of dark timber, stone, and white silk screens, heated from below by an ancient ondol floor system. Blessing sat in a deep armchair near the courtyard doors, wrapped in a heavy charcoal cashmere shawl he had left for her. Outside, snow was beginning to fall in fat, silent flakes, coating the curved eaves of the tiled roof in pure white. Her wound was healing, the sharp, tearing agony dulled to a persistent, heavy ache. But the emotional confinement was far more painful than the physical trauma. She was surrounded by 12 armed guards who bowed when she walked past, 2 private nurses who monitored her vitals every 4 hours, and an estate staff that treated her with the terrified reverence reserved for an empress. Yet she had not seen Han Joon-Okoye in 72 hours. He was in the estate. She knew this because she could hear his low, commanding voice drifting from the East Wing's study late into the night. She could smell the faint trace of sandalwood and cedar that lingered in the hallways after he walked through them. He was avoiding her with the calculated discipline of a general avoiding a poisoned well. The sliding screen door to the courtyard veranda clicked open. Joon-Okoye entered, carrying a black lacquered tray containing a bowl of traditional Korean medicinal soup and a ceramic pot of herbal tea. He wore no suit. He was dressed in a dark gray hanbok-inspired silk tunic with loose trousers, his sleeves rolled up to the elbows, revealing the full, stunning expanse of his ink, the Nigerian uli patterns winding around his forearms like ancient armor, merging with the Korean calligraphy etched along his inner wrists. He set the tray on the low wooden table beside her chair. "The physician said you refused your evening broth," he said, his voice level, his eyes carefully avoiding her face. Blessing looked at the tray, then looked up at him. Her soft eyes were clear, penetrating, and entirely unbothered by his manufactured distance. "I refused it because your staff scurries away the moment I try to ask a question," she said. "I am tired of being treated like a ghost in a museum, June." "You are recovering from a gunshot wound," he replied, taking a step back to re-establish his perimeter. "You need nourishment and rest, not conversation." "Why did you bring the tray yourself?" she asked softly. The question caught him off balance. The muscle in his sharp jaw tightened. "The staff was occupied," he lied. Blessing let out a quiet, breathy laugh that made her side ache. "There are 16 servants in this pavilion alone. You brought it because you haven't looked at me since the hospital, and your conscience is eating you alive." Joon-Okoye's dark eyes snapped to hers, cold and dangerous. "My conscience died 7 years ago, Miss John." "Then what is this?" she demanded, gesturing to the luxurious room, the warm clothes, the tray of hand-prepared medicine. "Why are you keeping me in your private sanctuary? If Choi's threat is handled, send me to a safe house." Send me back to my bakery. Why am I here? Because your bakery does not have bulletproof glass, he snapped, his control slipping, his voice rising in volume for the first time in days. Because your father's past is a hydra that keeps growing heads, and you are too stubborn to realize that the moment you step outside these walls without my name attached to you, you are dead. Your name? Blessing said, rising slowly from the chair, clutching the cashmere shawl around her bruised ribs. She walked toward him, each step deliberate, closing the distance he had worked so hard to maintain. What name is that, June? Creditor? Jailer? Or the one you used when you thought my heart had stopped beating? Joon-Okoye stood his ground, but his chest was heaving with suppressed fury. The scent of her, sweet, warm, like vanilla, almond flour, and clean rain, filled his lungs, dismantling the walls he had built with such agonizing effort. Do not push me, Blessing, he warned, his voice dropping into a harsh, ragged whisper. I am pushing you because you are hiding behind your ink and your suits, she cried, stopping right in front of him, her soft eyes blazing with an intoxicating mixture of anger and raw vulnerability. You saved my life twice. You held me against your chest while men were shooting at us. You stayed in that hospital corridor, all night. And now you stand here pretending you feel nothing. I feel nothing because feeling is a luxury that gets men killed, he roared, grabbing her upper arms, not to hurt her, but to hold her in place, his large, tattooed hands trembling with the sheer force of his restraint. Then let me go, she wept, tears finally spilling over her dark lashes, hot and fast. If I am just a debt, let me go and be destroyed. Stop torturing me with this halfway existence where you look at me like you want to die for me, but treat me like a stranger. Joon-Okoye looked down at her. He looked at the tears tracking down her rich, bronze skin. He looked at the soft, beautiful mouth that had defied him from the moment she dropped champagne glass on his floor. He looked at the woman who had invaded his frozen, empty world and set fire to everything he owned. The dam broke. His right hand moved from her arm to the side of her neck, his thumb wiping a tear from her cheek with a gentleness so profound, so devastating. It took the breath from her lungs. The tattoo on his wrist pressed against her jawline, warm and pulsing. I cannot let you go, he whispered, his voice cracking down the middle, exposing the raw, bleeding core of a man who had been shattered by love and rebuilt by fury. I tried. The night you left my penthouse in the rain, I tried to let you go. And every second of those 3 days felt like my own execution. Blessing's breath hitched. She reached up, her fingers wrapping around his wrist, feeling the heavy, irregular thud of his pulse. June. I made a promise to myself, he murmured, his forehead lowering until it rested against hers, his dark eyes searching hers with a desperate, agonizing intimacy. When my marriage ended in blood and treason, I stood over my mother's grave and swore I would never allow a woman to hold power over my breath again. I swore I would never love. He closed his eyes, his breath hot against her lips. And then you looked at me, he whispered, with those eyes. And you made a mockery of 7 years of iron. Blessing leaned into him, her hand moving up to touch the sharp, sculpted line of his jaw. Love is not treason, June. It was never treason. You just gave it to the wrong person. Joon-Okoye opened his eyes, dark and bottomless, filled with an obsession that had ceased to be a secret. If I give it to you, he said, his voice trembling with a terrifying, absolute devotion, there is no going back. There are no half measures. If you stay, you are bound to my world, my enemies, and my shadow. I will possess every corner of your life. I will destroy anyone who looks at you with malice. I will become your shield and your prison. I am not afraid of your shadow, she whispered. I only want the man behind it. He didn't answer with words. His hand slid around the back of her neck, his long fingers tangling in her dark hair, and he pulled her mouth to his. The kiss was not gentle. It was a collision of 2 worlds that had been spinning toward each other through fire and blood. It was possessive, desperate, and filled with 7 years of starvation. Blessing gasped against his lips, her hands clutching the silk of his tunic, her body melting against the broad, hard wall of his chest. The pain in her side vanished, eclipsed entirely by the searing heat of his mouth, the rough scrape of his jaw against hers, and the heavy, intoxicating realization that the silent sovereign had finally surrendered. When he pulled back, both of them were breathing hard, their foreheads pressed together in the quiet room while the snow fell silently outside. Joon-Okoye looked at her, his eyes shining with a fierce, unbreakable resolve. "Get some rest," he murmured, his thumb tracing the curve of her lower lip. "Tomorrow we finish this." 2 weeks later, the winter had locked Seoul in a vice of sub-zero temperatures and clear, black skies. The venue for the Grand Council of the East Asian Maritime Coalition was the historic stone house at the Walker Hill Estate, a sprawling, fortress-like manor overlooking the eastern mountains, surrounded by 4 layers of armed security checkpoints. Tonight, 72 heads of the most powerful corporate families and underground syndicates in East Asia were gathered to ratify the new maritime treaties following the collapse of the Choi dynasty. The grand banquet hall was a sea of black tuxedos, traditional silk robes, and heavy fur coats. Whispers rippled through the crowd like an electric current. The news of the Choi family's exile had shaken the underworld to its core, but the rumors surrounding the sovereign's private life were even more volatile. The story of the hospital, the forbidden word, the foreign woman, the crack in the Iron Empire had spread to every ear. The massive double doors at the head of the hall swung open. Han Joon-Okoye entered. A collective hush fell over the 72 leaders. He wore a tailored tuxedo of midnight blue, cut from heavy English wool that accentuated his broad, lethal frame. His dress shirt was crisp white, the collar perfectly framing the tiger and uli tattoo that rose up his neck like a royal standard. His expression was sculpted granite, his dark eyes sweeping the room with an authority so complete that men with decades of criminal supremacy instinctively lowered their heads. On his arm walked Blessing John. The room gasped. She did not look like a survivor of a gunshot wound. She looked like a queen who had arrived to claim her tribute. She wore a custom-designed gown of deep bronze and emerald silk, its high collar framing the elegant curve of her neck, the fabric cascading to the floor with an effortless, regal grace. Her hair was styled in an intricate, sculptural updo woven with delicate gold thread. Her soft, expressive eyes met the stares of the most dangerous men in Asia without a single flicker of hesitation. Beside her, Joon-Okoye's hand rested over hers on his arm, his tattooed knuckles broad and protective over her delicate fingers. At the center of the hall, Minister Bae Sung-jin, a corrupt senior official from the Ministry of Oceans and Fisheries, allied with the remnants of the Incheon syndicate, stepped forward, holding a crystal glass of champagne. "Mr. Han," Minister Bae said, his voice loud enough to carry across the silent hall, dripping with thinly veiled hostility. "We are honored by your presence. But protocol for the Grand Council is strict. Only verified principals and their legal spouses are permitted entry to the treaty ratification chamber. External companions must remain in the outer salon." The insult was deliberate, sharp, and designed to test the sovereign's boundaries in front of his peers. Blessing felt the tension in the room spike to a lethal threshold. Joon-Okoye did not release her arm. He did not look at Minister Bae with anger. He looked at him with the cold, detached amusement of an executioner listening to a condemned man's last joke. He took 3 slow, measured steps forward, bringing Blessing with him until they stood at the exact center of the Grand Council's ceremonial dais. The chandelier light caught the ink along his collarbone, the tiger's eye gleaming through the split of his lapel. Joon-Okoye raised his left hand, signaling to Director Park, who stepped forward and placed a heavy, leather-bound portfolio on the central podium. "Minister Bae," Joon-Okoye said, his low baritone resonating through the vaulted ceiling like a church bell in an empty cathedral. "You speak of protocol as if you have the authority to define it." He turned slightly, his dark eyes settling on Blessing with a look so open, so proud, so terrifyingly complete in its devotion that the entire room seemed to hold its breath. He reached down, taking her right hand in his, lifting it before the entire assembly of East Asia's elite. On her fourth finger sat a ring of black platinum, set with a flawless, untreated raw diamond from the mines of West Africa, the ancestral seal of the Okoye dynasty, a ring that had not been worn by a living woman in over a century. Joon-Okoye turned his gaze back to the 72 syndicate leaders, his jaw set, his voice dropping into a register of absolute, sovereign decree. "She does not wait in the outer salon," Joon-Okoye said, each word ringing with the power of an empire forged in blood and sealed in truth. "She sits at the head of the table. She holds half of every port, every ship, and every ledger bearing my name." He looked directly into the pale, terrified eyes of Minister Bae. "She is my wife." The declaration landed like an earthquake. This was not a slip of the tongue in a blood-soaked trauma bay. This was not a desperate plea to an uncaring ceiling. This was a vow, spoken with deliberate, terrifying pride before his peers, his enemies, and the world he ruled. The word was claimed. The lie was dead. Minister Bae's glass slipped from his fingers, shattering across the polished floor in a spray of sparkling wine. Around the room, syndicate leaders bowed their heads one by one, submitting to the new order. Blessing looked up at the man beside her. His sharp, beautiful face was turned down toward her, the coldness entirely gone from his piercing eyes, replaced by a love so vast, so relentless, that it had reshaped an entire empire just to give her a home. She squeezed his tattooed hand, her fingers locking with his ooly-marked knuckles. "Let's ratify your treaty, Mr. Han," she whispered, her smile luminous in the glittering light of the ballroom. "Our treaty, Mrs. Han," he corrected softly, his lips curving into the rarest, most devastating smile of his life. 6 months later, the early summer sun warmed the terracotta-tiled terrace of the newly rebuilt artisan bakery in the heart of Yongsan. The scent of fresh cardamom, toasted coconut, and proofing dough drifted into the quiet morning street. Outside, 2 discreet security sedans sat parked at the corner, their presence a silent, impenetrable wall that guaranteed the peace of the neighborhood. Blessing stood at the marble preparation island, wearing a simple linen apron over a cream-colored dress, dusting flour over a row of golden, braided meat pies. Her skin was glowing, the scar on her abdomen completely healed, her soft eyes filled with a deep, untroubled serenity. The bell above the entrance chimed with a light, cheerful ring. She did not need to look up to know who had entered. The shift in the atmosphere, the sudden, warm gravity that always heralded his presence, settled over the bakery like a familiar blanket. Han Joon-Okoye walked behind the counter. He wore no suit today. He was dressed in a simple, perfectly fitted black t-shirt and dark slacks, his sleeves exposing the full tapestry of his dual heritage ink. On his left ring finger, matching hers, was the band of black platinum. He walked up behind her, wrapping his powerful arms around her waist, pulling her back against the broad, warm wall of his chest. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, breathing in the scent of flour, vanilla, and the woman who had saved his soul. "You're late," she murmured, leaning her head back against his shoulder. "The Lagos logistics team needed a reminder that my schedule belongs to my family, not their shipping schedules," he murmured against her skin, his lips pressing a warm, lingering kiss to the pulse point beneath her ear. Blessing turned in his embrace, resting her flour-dusted hands against the broad span of his chest, directly over the tiger tattoo that guarded his heart. "You are becoming soft, sovereign," she teased, her eyes dancing with affection. "Only for you," he whispered, his dark eyes holding hers with that same fierce, unbreakable devotion that had conquered an empire. "Only for my wife." The word was no longer a mistake. It was no longer a wound. It was their fortress. And as the morning sun poured through the glass windows, illuminating the warmth of the bakery, the ink on his skin, and the quiet triumph in their eyes, the silent sovereign bent his head and kissed the only woman he could never lose. Thank you for listening to this cinematic story of obsession, healing, and a love that redefined power. If you are moved by this journey, please like, share, and subscribe for more immersive dark romance narratives.